Good evening, night walkers. Quick question for your nerves. If a shuttered railway station read your name over its loudspeakers, would you go home or go inside? Keep close. You're listening to Somnolent Conspiracies, where we greet you properly, ask you to think with us, and keep evidence steady even when the dark borrows a voice. New Delhi keeps two kinds of stations, the ones that never sleep and the ones the city forgot. On the old South Service wing, gates rolled down, ticket windows welded shut. The horn speakers still hang like tired mouths. 3 nights this month at 2:17 exactly, they woke. No chime, no train number. A female announcement voice, flat, official, read a single name and a place, Ria Vyas, Patel Nagar, Tarun Mehra, Sadar Bazaar. By sundown, each named person was found dead. A shopkeeper in a locked godown, a student under a flyover, a fixer in a back lane where the light never lands. Police cut the power. The speakers still found breath. Our detective does not believe in prophecies. She believes in public address amplifiers and in the kinds of men who make ghosts out of copper wire. We will climb a signal ladder, follow a cable that should have been dead, and listen to the way a voice can be stitched from syllables the city already trusts. We will test who has keys to a shutter that hasn't rolled in years, who buys prepaid SIM cards by the fistful, and who thinks justice sounds best in the language of trains. The station will speak. We'll answer back with a proof you can hold. Ready? If the horn speakers crackle, note the second, not the shiver. Let's step onto the platform the city closed and see who kept the microphone. Part 1, the voice over a closed gate. Asha Menon entered the South Service wing by stepping through the triangle of light where a panel of the corrugated shutter no longer fit. The rest of the gate was cinched shut with 2 old brass locks. Dust lay on the steel like ash after a fire. She pressed her thumb into it and watched the oval mark hold its shape. Nobody had rolled these shutters in years. The metal remembered silence. The concourse behind her was a low hum of the living station. Somewhere far off, the main platforms coughed a whistle and a chain of coaches groaned like an animal learning to rise. Here in the wing the sound was a rumor. There were horn speakers fixed near the ceiling, broad cones with lips that had turned gray. They were the mouths of the dead wing, and they were the reason she was here. She took off her sunglasses and hooked them at her collar. The air smelled of iron, paper glue, stale shrubs from the vendor stands that had been swept away long ago, and the common dust that falls from any city if you give it enough time. Asha lifted her eyes to the speakers and saw the black crescents near the rims. Not grease, not insects, soot arcs. A thin smoke stain like a long breath had been blown out from inside the cone and had curled back. It happens when a diaphragm moves hard enough to kick tiny filaments of carbon loose, the way a match leaves a crescent on a plate. The station had spoken here. That was the report. At 2:17 on 3 different nights, a woman's voice had woken in these horns, announced a single name and a place, then died again. By sundown, each named person had been found dead. Asha did not write the word omen in her notebook. She wrote the time and underlined it twice. She moved along the shutter line. Every seam wore its own script of dirt. The ticket windows were welded closed. The glass was painted over on the inside with a gray that had leached toward green. She glanced at the floor for footprints and saw only the slip of her own soul crossing itself. There were no fresh trails. The idea calmed her in a hard way. If the voice was here, it came by wire. The security guard met her at the side door with a ring of keys and the apology of a man who has learned to be careful with his voice. He said he had never heard the announcements himself because he slept during that hour. His eyes were red as if embarrassed by their usefulness. She took the keys and promised nothing. She had called a small team from the crime branch. 2 plainclothes officers already drifted near the concourse end as if waiting for a late train. They had radios tucked away like guilty things. She did not want uniforms to feed the story that a ghost spoke through the speakers. She wanted the story to be about power and a hand. Inside the wing was a narrow corridor with walls of peeling cream paint and a bulletin board that still held a schedule from 3 winters past. The paper was brown where the pins had been. Asha followed the corridor to the locked equipment room. The steel door had a wire glass slit covered by a rusted mesh. When she found the right key, the lock turned with a patient scrape. She opened the door with her shoulder steady against it because old hinges fail like knees and kick back. The room was dry and warm. Shelves with cables nested in dead tidy circles. A rack of electronics stood against the far wall, the kind used to feed announcements to platforms where people still waited and listened. The master switch in the hall was already down. She had thrown it with the guard watching. Still, there was a soft sound in the room like a cat asleep. She stepped closer. The rack hummed. It was the sort of hum that feels in the teeth more than the ear. A battery pack somewhere kept a little heart beating. Asha crouched to look under the bottom shelf. A fat ribbon of conduit went into the concrete. The conduit's paint had flaked in neat rectangles. No one had kicked it. No one had stepped here. She put her palm near the rack vents and felt heat that only machines give. It was not much. Enough to say the rack was alive in a way the rest of the wing was not. She followed the laddered back of the rack and read the hand labels on patch cables, one neat block print repeating. Input A, platform mix, monitor return, then a handwritten tag that did not match the others.
Usine.
She traced it with 2 fingers and found it ran behind the rack faceplate into the dark like a suspicion. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The audio technician had arrived and stood now in the doorway waiting for permission to breathe on the equipment. He was a gentle man with a gentler case of tools. She told him to set 2 microphones in the room and 1 in the corridor ceiling outside. The microphones would not frighten the room, but they would remember it. He nodded and moved in slow arcs, taping with care, like someone dressing a sleeping child. Asha opened her notebook and wrote the names the horns had spoken. Ria Vyas, Tarun Mehra, Imran Qureshi. She wrote the places after each name as if the places belonged to the people in a way beyond address. Patel Nagar, Sadr Bazar, Nabi Karim. She did not add the word dead, though it tried to crawl up her pencil. The plainclothes officers radioed from the concourse end that a stray had slipped under the shutter and nosed the empty stalls, a white and tan shadow that left a clean little track. Asha told them to let it go. The city lives in these edges. She finished her walk of the wing and noted each door and grate and window. She looked at the padlocks again and took photographs with her phone from 3 angles. The soot arcs on the speakers she shot with the flash off so the shadows would tell their true shape. When she returned to the equipment room, the technician had already wired a small recorder to the main output. He looked apologetic for having done work without words. She nodded. The guard hovered like a moth at the door. Asha asked for the master breaker once more. They walked back to the hall box. She switched the power off again with a firm hand, then stood in the quiet waiting for the lie, and the lie came. The rack still hummed. A battery somewhere smiled with secret teeth. She told the guard to bring her a ladder. She wanted to stand with the horn speaker mouths and look them in the eye. The guard brought a ladder that had seen paint more than feet. She steadied it against the wall under the nearest speaker and climbed until her head was level with the cone. She could have put her hand on the rim, but she did not. She leaned close and smelled the long dry of paper and a whisper of hot dust that machines make when they work against sleep. The soot ring had the shape of a fingerprint relieved of its loops. It was not old. The particles still smudged under the tip of a pencil eraser. She climbed down and wrote a single line. Cones vibrated recently. 2 more plainclothes officers arrived and melted into the concourse shadows with tea in their hands to make the act of waiting look honest. Asha briefed them in 10 sentences standing in the corridor. They would keep eyes on all approaches from the living station. They would ignore the busy theater of the night and watch for anyone whose attention stuck to this wing. The technician would sit with the equipment and let the recorders do their work. She would stay till dawn and then some. They all agreed without raising their voices. She checked her watch. The face caught the lamplight and gave it back with a polite shrug. It was early yet. She took a slow walk to the far end of the wing where a staircase rose to a closed grill. Through the slats she could see a smear of neon from the main hall, a knot of travelers sleeping around their bags like sea birds around a rock. The living station spoke its own language of shoes on stone, a vendor's tired call, a baby's brief cry, the steel echo that says there is always another train. Asha returned to the rack and sat on a wooden stool that had survived the evacuation of the wing. She set her notebook on her knee and drew a rough map of what she had seen. Shutter line, ticket windows, equipment room, beakers. She wrote a question at the bottom. Who wants a station to speak a name that ends a life? Then she crossed out the last 3 words and wrote ends a day. She did not like prophecies and would not write them into a room that already had too much story pressed into its walls. At 1:45 the wing had settled around them like a hand closing. The recorder's light held steady. The technician had closed his eyes for a moment and opened them again without being asked. From the concourse came the soft rustle of the 2 officers trading watch at the rail. Somewhere above, a pigeon shifted in a vent and reconsidered its nest. Asha tapped her pencil once to wake her own patience and set the pencil down. Everything that would be ready was ready. She checked the seals on the side door and the back gate. She checked the shutter locks and saw again her first thumbprint in the dust. She returned to the stool and did nothing. She let the hour do its work. The wing was a throat waiting for a word. If the station spoke, a wire would carry it and a will would choose it. She listened to the hum in the rack and the thin, almost imaginary hiss in the speakers when the building turned in its sleep. She watched the second hand of her watch and did not watch the shiver that tried to crawl up her back. They would wait and listen. Part 2, 2:17. The hour thinned until the walls seemed to lose weight. The technician checked his recorder with a glance that did not disturb the air. The guard had retreated to his stool near the side door, a small island lit by a bulb that made his face look made of wax. The plainclothes officers murmured that the concourse was quiet and then turned their radios down until they were only lamps in their hands. Asha stood in the equipment room doorway with her notebook closed. She did not want a pen scratching when the moment came. The rack's small fan gave a thread of sound, steady and patient. It was the breath of something kept alive against the wish of the breaker switch. She watched the second hand of her watch walk toward the minute and then the minute after that. She let her heart do whatever it wanted and did not ask it for news. At 2:16, the technician lifted one finger from the recorder case as if he were asking a question of the room. Asha nodded without meaning to. They did not speak. They did not need to. The atmosphere had a balance to it, the sense a tightrope has when a foot is about to land. She stood still. At 2:17, the rack woke. It did not lurch. It did not whine. The tiny green bar on the power meter shivered and rose by a notch. Asha took one step in, close enough to see the smallest needles flick. Somewhere above her head, the horn speakers took a breath and exhaled a hiss like paper rubbed together. The room gathered itself. Then the voice came. Nina Kulkarni, Carol Bog. It was a woman's voice made for platforms and travel. It wore the calm that tells a crowd what to do and expects to be obeyed. But the calm had seams. The name arrived in clean pieces, beautiful and wrong. Na, Anna, Kul, Kar, and I. The last vowel had a brightness that did not belong to the ones before it, as if daylight had been spliced into night, as if someone had lifted syllables like tiles from other floors and set them in a new hall. Carol came out like a round bell. Bog was true on the tongue and then fell away too quickly. A door pushed shut before the latch could catch. The sentence lasted less than a breath. The horns went from living to dead again with a small cough of static. A thread cut. The station did not speak a second word. It did not read a train number or remind anyone to mind the gap. The quiet returned as if nothing had happened and the wing was a thing Asha had imagined. Only the soot ring remembered the shout. The technician looked down at the power meter and then at the small panel on the lower rack shelf. He did not touch anything. He said low and careful that the current draw had jumped on an auxiliary line. Asha stepped closer. The faceplate of the rack did not match at one small rectangle. There was a thin slot, almost a scar, running along the edge of what should have been a blank. Behind it a light that did not belong to this era glowed the sick blue of a cheap night. The technician leaned and read a few letters stenciled near a jack. He said the words cellular modem and did not guess at brand. He did not need to. He held up the recorder to show its red light, steady and unhurt. Asha told the concourse team to move. 2 words were enough. They peeled away without haste. taking the stairs that led to the street and then toward the lanes of Carroll Bog where the night never quite decides to end. She told them the name. The officers did not ask how to spell it. The name was still in the corridors of the station, hanging in the beams and rivets, vibrating in things that could hold the memory of a note. Asha stood alone with the technician and the guard and the rack that had swallowed the call. She looked at the small slot again. It was the shape of a door cut into a wall and painted the same color to fool a child. The hum had changed from a steady thread to a woven one, as if another room had been invited into this room only for a second. She wanted to pull the faceplate and see the small heart that had beat, but she did not touch it. Evidence is a door you open only when the camera is watching and the list of hands is written. The guard whispered that he had heard it this time. He had the look of a man who had believed in sleep as a cure and meant to return to it quickly. Asha let him keep his stool. She told him nothing about ghosts. He would make his own choice about that. The technician rewound the recorder half a minute and played the capture at half volume on a tiny speaker that made everything sound smaller than it had felt. The sentence arrived again like the underbelly of a wave, the seams more visible when reduced. Asha could hear the cut between the last letter of the surname and the first of the place as clearly as she could see a staggered brick in a wall. She closed her eyes and followed the air in the syllables. The voice had a room inside it that was not this room. It had the old hiss of the main station, the well of a busy hall, the breath a speaker gives to a sentence when it is designed to be trusted. Someone had dressed the splice in familiar clothes so the ear would not flinch. The radio on the stool near the door clicked. The concourse team had moved quickly through the main hall, where a vendor was boiling tea no one would drink. They had cut through a service lane where an iron shutter wore a private language of dents. They had reached the high road and then the narrow roads where bikes owned the dark. Their voices came in short notes. The words were not for drama. They were for distance and direction. Asha stood with the radio against her shoulder and did not ask them to run. When the officers reached the clinic street, the radio gave a different sound. Not excitement. Something like the sound a match makes when it gives up its first light to air. A male voice said they had found her. He said she was on the floor near a stair, as if she had been trying to stand when her legs changed their mind. He said her pulse was slow but present. Asha told them to keep her there only long enough to make sure her breathing did not stumble. Then to take her in. Then to tell the nearest uniformed unit to hold the corridor for a photograph of the place as they had found it and the people who watched them find it. The technician looked at Asha and waited. She did not smile. She told him to keep recording. She told him to write down the exact time the rack woke on its own and the exact reading on the meter and the shape of the blue light behind the slot. He nodded and took out a pencil as if it were a ritual blade. Asha walked the corridor once, slow. The wing had loosened its grip on itself after the voice. The air felt a degree cooler. She put her hand on the shutter near the mouth that no longer fit and felt the faint vibration of the city on the other side. She wrote in her notebook 3 lines with no flourishes. The rack woke without main power. The voice wore spliced syllables that copied official rhythm. The target name survived. She underlined the last word once and put the pencil away. The plainclothes officers called again to say the clinic nurse had returned from a smoke break to find a young woman in a simple dress half folded near the wall. No marks on the skin, no blood, no broken things in the hall, no footprints that meant more than dirty shoes carry. There was a smell like a sweet chemical lingering above the floor, as if a ghost had chosen a perfume and then changed its mind. The nurse had pressed a cloth to the mouth and nose and called her superior, and then the call had moved the way calls move when no one wants to be the person responsible for a dying stranger. The officers had moved faster than the call. Asha asked for the woman's first words if she had any. The officer said her eyes had moved once and she had tried to swallow, and then the swallow had decided to wait. He said the ambulance was close. He said the street had started to open its eyes and the men who slept on cots had shifted to make way for the stretcher because everyone understands a stretcher even when they pretend they do not. Asha let the radio rest and looked again at the rack. The small slot had gone dark. Whatever had ridden the line had hung up. A wire had carried a sentence in from somewhere that was not here. A will had chosen a name. The will had not killed the name. That work had been planned but not completed. If the system was a mouth, then someone else was a hand. She stood under the horn speakers and listened to what remained. She did not pray and she did not thank luck. She turned to the technician and asked him to show her every line that carried signal into the rack and out of it. He nodded and began to trace the cables as if he were reading a river with his fingertips. The work would be simple and slow and honest. Outside the shutter, the big station grew louder by degrees until the wing felt like a pier at low tide. The night had passed its point. It would give them a thin morning and then a sun that made men squint and tell the same story 3 different ways. Asha closed her notebook and set it on the stool for a moment. She rubbed the bridge of her nose and saw in the private dark the cut of the syllables, the borrowed hiss, the blue light behind the plate. She opened her eyes to the room that hummed. The wing had spoken. Now it would explain. Part 3: Wires that should be dead. Morning pressed against the shutter like a palm. The big station had cleared its throat and begun to speak in full sentences again. Inside the closed wing, the light was dusty and undecided. Asha asked the guard for the ladder once more and had him set it under a broken vent whose grill hung by a single screw like a loose tooth. The technician steadied the ladder. Asha climbed until her shoulders were in the stale square of air. At first she saw only pigeon claw marks and a feather stuck in a spider's abandoned geometry. Then she saw a small rectangle glued to the back of the grill where a repair patch should have been. It was a black panel the size of a book. A thin wire ran from it into the wall void. The surface was dull, not glossy. She scraped at the dust with a gloved finger and found faint letters she could not read until she angled the light. They were the kind of letters printed on panels meant for rooftops. She felt the quiet pride of a patient answer. Solar. She descended and asked for a flathead screwdriver. The guard produced a collection of tools in a cloth wrap that smelled of rust and hard use. With the technician holding the ladder, Asha loosened the remaining screw and lowered the bent vent cover by degrees so it would not clang and betray their small secret to the hall beyond. Behind the vent mouth, the black panel slept. Its thin wires slipped down inside the cavity and into the wall chase that led to the equipment room. Someone had fed the rack with a trickle that the breaker could not starve. They traced the slender cable inside the wall by tapping and listening until the sound turned to a tighter knock. In the equipment room, the technician opened a blank metal plate near the floor. The cable passed through and into a small shoebox-sized unit that had been mounted behind the rack carpentry, hidden by a false panel. The unit was clipped with a tiny green light that spoke in a single blink every few seconds. The label was scratched off with a pocket knife. Asha did not need to read it. A unit like this took the shy power of a sun panel and made it into a slow battery. The battery, in turn, kept something awake. The rack wore its face like a dutiful clerk. Asha unscrewed a narrow cover at the bottom of the faceplate, one that had never belonged to the original build. The technician read the screw heads first and said they had been tightened with more care than the rack deserved. Inside, someone had fixed a small battery pack, wrapped in black heat shrink, fastened with a strip of double-sided tape, and then, for good measure, with cloth ties the color of old bandages. From the battery, a cable ran to a component mounted on a bracket that had once held a blanking panel. The component had no logo. It had a pair of pins for power and a pair of jacks that looked like small mouths waiting for a story. One jack matched the thin wire labeled AUX in. The other held a stubby black antenna that had been disguised with a sleeve of gray tape to make it look like a ground wire. The component had a little speaker grill that would never be used and a slot the width of a thumbnail that hid a card. Asha leaned close. On the side of the board, in the tidy etching that factories give their children, were 2 words enough for a map. Audio gateway. The technician breathed out a soft yes. He did not touch the card. He let the light rake across it and read the letters without saying them. A series of numbers that could buy time and disappear at a roadside stall. If you know what you are doing, you can call such a gateway and it will answer the way a tired man answers his name. You can play the voice you have prepared. If you are more careful, you can make the gateway refuse any number but the ones you choose. Asha felt the thought settle like a coin in water. The rack had been turned into a phone. The wing had been turned into an ear. There was one more device. It was small enough to hide in a palm, fixed with solder in a position that said the hand had been steady. A relay, its shell scratched, bridged a pair of pins going to the amplifier board inside the rack. The technician followed the lines with a tester probe and nodded as if answering himself. He said the relay sat across the mute. He explained without breathing harder that when the relay drew current, it would pull the mute low and keep it there no matter what the console outside tried to say. The console could be off and still the room would speak if the relay had orders. Asha let the story of the parts become a person. A person with a panel to drink light and a battery for blood. A person with a mouth that would answer only to a small club of callers. A person with a finger stuck forever to the throat of the amplifier so that, at the right moment, the throat could be opened without asking the house for permission. She photographed every step. The grill, the panel, the cable, the box, the peeled faceplate, the battery wrapped like a secret, the little antenna that had pretended to be nothing. She stood the guard at the door with instructions to admit no one and to speak to no one about vents or sunlight. The guard said yes the way a man says yes to weather. The technician unpacked a small field recorder with an oscilloscope display. He clipped it into the AUX in line and then into the speaker line to see what shape the voice had when it moved. He showed Asha the hum she had felt in her molars as a simple ripple. He showed her the quiet between ripples where a dial tone would live if the gateway had chosen to behave like an old desk phone. He showed her nothing more because the gateway was not awake. Asha asked him to lift the faceplate on the bracketed component just enough to read a model code on the underside. He did, taking care not to dislodge the antenna. He wrote the code in his notebook and then wrote a list of ordinary vendors in the city who sold such things behind claims like emergency paging and home intercom. While he worked, Asha stood under the nearest horn speaker and let the morning deepen. Toy sellers began to rattle their sticks on the far side of the shutter like a small rain. A porter called to a friend using the particular insult that means brother when the day is beginning. The wing's cones remained quiet and faintly proud. She looked up at the soot ring and knew it would grow again tonight if someone called the gateway when the minute struck. She did not plan to give that person the pleasure. Asha asked the technician if the gateway could be made to answer only numbers written in its memory. The technician said yes and then said it could also be made to ignore every number after the one that had just called until it had been reset. He pointed to a small recessed switch on the component that would have to be pressed with a pin to change the list. He said it would be possible to read that list and copy it without telling the gateway what they were doing, if they were careful and if they had the right adapter. He had the adapter. He had brought it because he was the kind of man who keeps small careful tools for unlikely days. He warned Asha that reading the list now would count as touching evidence. Asha looked at the room as if it were a person in a hospital bed, tubes arranged, numbers kept, and said they would do it under video with her body camera running. She told him to proceed and to keep his breath slow. They captured the list. It was short, a handful of numbers, each with an odd spacing, as if someone had entered them with a phone whose screen had a crack the size of a hair across the lower third. The last number did not sit in a sequence. It matched nothing Asha recognized as a pattern used by the railways or by police. It felt like a number bought in a hurry and meant to be thrown away. She asked the technician to check the relay again. He measured the coil and read out a resistance that told him the part was cheap but serviceable. He traced the coil's leads to a set of wires that had been heat-spliced not with a sleeve but with careful solder wrapped in cloth tape that looked like electrician's tape bought from a neighborhood shop. The way the tape had been torn left a serrated tongue. It was a detail without obvious meaning, but detail is a habit. She filed it with the other habits. The guard brought tea without asking, the kind poured into paper cups that turn soft if you do not commit. Asha drank and felt the wakefulness settle in the clean way it did when the hard part of the night was already behind her. She told the technician to label the gateway in place and leave it intact. She wanted the next calls to land on their recorder, their meters, their eyes. She wanted the person on the other end to feel that nothing had changed. She wanted the story to tell itself in the order someone else had written and then to find the hand. Before she left the wing for the first time since the hour, she walked the corridor once more. She checked each grate and door and lock. She wrote a short chain for the case file. Uninterrupted shutter. Undisturbed dust. Rack active on independent power. Solar panel hidden behind vent. Battery pack fixed to rack interior. Audio gateway with cellular card wired to auxiliary input. Relay soldered across mute to force amplifier open. She underlined the last point because it said motive in a language of copper. At the threshold, she looked back the way one looks back at a room where a child is sleeping. The horn speakers sat like old saints who had been given new scripture without their consent. She promised them nothing. Promises are for people. Wires exact their own price. She stepped into the station daylight. A rush of voices met her that did not know her name. She let them pass through her and then lifted her phone. She called her team lead and requested the call detail records for the hour and the hour before, centered on numbers that had touched the gateway's card. She requested camera pulls from the far edges of the station that looked toward the floodplain where signals bounced clear. She requested a list of small shops that had bought audio gateways over the last year, and a list of technicians who had done maintenance in the southern wing in the years when it still lived. Behind her, inside the closed wing, the room hummed as if agreeing that the next step was not faith but map-making. Ahead of her, the platforms threw back heat and noise and the clatter of a city that had never asked permission to go on. She put her notebook into her pocket and began to walk. Someone calls this place at 2 in the morning and gives it a sentence to speak. Find the voice that chooses the names. Find the hand that sends the call. Part 4, The 3 Dead Before. The city gave back heat by mid-morning. Asha stood in a dim records office where labeled boxes slept on metal shelves and air moved only when people did. A clerk with careful hair and a practiced reluctance helped her pull complaint files and case notes tied to 3 names. He had learned to survive by understanding which work would be remembered and which would vanish into the concrete. She slid each file into her bag and left him a receipt signed in a square hand. In a small interview room at the crime branch, Asha spread the papers and the photocopies into the neat islands she favored. She set 3 pens across the top row like coordinates. Ria Vyas, Tarun Mehra, Imran Qureshi. She drew the place names on a second line below each. Patel Nagar, Sadr Bazaar, Nabi Karim. Then she turned on the desk fan and let the edges of the paper lift and settle, as if the facts were learning how to breathe. Ria first. A shopkeeper whose aisles had once smelled of new plastic and warm spice. A woman who watched her numbers like a temple watches its lamp. 2 months before she died, she had filed a complaint about men who leaned against the shutter at closing time and asked for money not because they needed it but because they were professionals at needing. She had written a precise note in a clean hand naming 3 shopfronts they visited in a loop and the phrases they used to sell safety. The record of follow-up had 2 lines and a stamp that meant waiting. There was a second sheet in Ria's file. A phone photo of a small grate in the back lane with a cut wire curled inside it like a dead worm. The caption said she had found the wire after a night of someone fiddling at her meter box. The photograph had been printed at a kiosk and glued to the page with the kind of adhesive that browns over time. Asha touched the edge of the photograph with her knuckle and felt the grit of dried glue. Tarun, a reporter whose last 3 pieces were online columns about a builder who reused cement and called it efficiency. The builder's men called him a nuisance in a comment thread and promised to sue him for defamation. The editor had written an email to the station house asking for a little care on the roads near the office. The email had not been printed. The file contained only a typed summary and a small note that said his motorbike had been found near a flyover, parked neatly, as if its owner had meant to come back after a quick errand and had not. There was a scanned image of a notebook page from Tarun's desk. He had written a list of numbers and names. The builder, 2 middlemen, a bank manager who liked to sponsor school cricket trophies. The note stopped midline. The scan showed a grain of dust or sugar at the corner as if a snack had been eaten while the list was made, as if the body insists that work and hunger often share a table. Imran, a railway porter whose hands could tell a suitcase's weight by memory. He had given a statement about a beating he had witnessed in a back lane behind a private go-down near Sadr Bazaar. He had signed with the careful block letters of a man who wanted to be legible. The case had grown no branches from that trunk. The man who had been beaten had moved away or learned to say he had fallen. The porter had returned to the heavy music of his work. Weeks later, his name had come out of a horn speaker like a verdict. Asha drew arrows. Ria to Sadr Bazaar. Tarun to a builder who funded half the banners on a market street. Imran to a go down by the line where trucks stood for hours with their mouths open. Each arrow bent toward the northwestern quadrant of the map she kept in her head, the mesh of lanes where goods and favors passed like breath. She set the 3 files aside and called a constable with soft shoes and a good memory for faces. She asked him for photographs from the crime scenes, not just the official ones. She wanted the edges. He returned with a folder of images that did not tell a story so much as admit one. Ria had been found in her shop's back room behind a folding table with a ledger open on its last page. No broken locks. No smashed bargains. A towel had been wet and then wrung and left on the floor like a question. There was a smell in the description that matched the clinic corridor where Nina had been found. Chloroform is an old ghost that never quite leaves. Tarun's body had lain against a concrete pillar as if he had stopped there to listen for a road. There was a bruise behind his ear that did not belong to a fall. No wallet missing. No blade or blunt object left. The camera had caught a pair of tire tracks on the dust film where City had not yet conquered. The tracks had a shallow diagonal cut in one tread, the kind that comes from hitting the same pothole every night until rubber learns it like a prayer. Imran had been discovered behind the go-down by a worker who had gone to urinate in peace. The man had spoken slowly to the camera. He had seen a shadow with a headlamp pass down the lane 2 hours earlier, a bike sound with a throatier note than most. He had assumed nothing. The porter's pockets still had coins. The back of his neck had a mark like a thumb had been pressed and held. Asha felt the similar tendon running through the particulars. No mess, no theater. Work done under a schedule. If fear was meant to rise, it was meant to rise after the act, not during. The horn speaker was not just a mouth. It was a clock. A time set at 2:17 so bodies could be found by their neighbors when the day woke and stories could spread in the kind of light that never examines its own hands. She pushed back from the desk and let the fan lift a corner of the map she had drawn with words. She called her plainclothes officers at the closed wing and asked for updates on the equipment room watch. The technician had reshaped his cables into a more perfect order and sat reading the curve of the hum on his recorder like an astrologer in a world that believed in electricity. The guard had developed a powerful interest in not being told anything at all. Asha walked down the corridor to a small kitchen, poured tea into the same kind of paper cup as before, and returned to her islands of facts. She began calling people. She spoke to Ria's brother, who talked about her pride and her refusal to be smaller for anyone. She spoke to Tarun's editor, who talked about his staff's fear and the way the story had a gravity that pulled unknown stones loose. She spoke to a porter whose voice carried the deliberate pace of a man who had learned to cross tracks without losing a toe. He spoke about Imran's insistence on neat stacks and good balance. The brothers and the bosses asked for promises. Asha offered only the sentences she could keep. We are working. We have a path. We will keep calling. By noon, she sat with a second set of copies on the table for a different purpose. She made a list titled Witness Ecosystem. Ria had attended a local merchants association. Tarun had 3 sources on his last story, 1 anonymous and 2 whose names had been mentioned in a late-night call to his phone 2 days before he was found. Imran had shared chai with 2 loaders and an off-duty guard who preferred to be paid in cash by men who carried ledgers. Lines began to join. If you were looking for people who might talk, you could look at these circles and find them. She wrote a sentence under the list. Names selected are not random. Selection scans for those who speak. In Asha's experience, selection is done by either a lazy mind or a careful one. The lazy mind chooses proximity and loudness. The careful mind chooses leverage. Ria had leverage because she threatened a habit with paper. Tarun had leverage because he aimed a microphone and kept his own battery charged. Imran had leverage because he had eyes where men stored things they did not want to declare. The horn speakers had said their names to make a crowd fear the cost of talking. Someone else had turned that fear into bodies. The day pressed on. Asha reviewed call records landing in her inbox like small square birds. The numbers touched to the audio gateway in the rack lined up at the same minute on 3 nights. Each came from a tower near the river where the air stands thick in the summer and men teach dogs to bark at nothing. The evenness of the timing said a mind that liked orders and schedules more than prayer. It said a phone resting on a dashboard while fingers watched seconds tick toward power. She called a traffic constable posted to a camera control room and asked for pulls from weak eyes facing the floodplain roads. He sent grainy videos in which everything looked coated in dull powder. In one frame, a white van sat in a turnout, its nose angled toward the road as if waiting to be let back into a story. The camera could not read plates at that distance, could read habits. The van had been there at 2:10 on 2 of the nights the horn speakers had spoken. It had left at 2:20, a man stepping into the driver's seat fast as if ashamed of his own limbs. She circled the van with a pen and drew another arrow to another box. A white van near a bare bank and a weak tower and a time the city uses for dreaming. She wrote a short prayer to the god of patterns she did not believe in. Not a plea, a statement. If the same van sits again tonight, we will have enough to pull it over and ask whose breath sits on its steering wheel. But she did not want to wait for a miracle of repetition. She wanted a chain. She returned to the 3 files and read the small things. Ria's list of the racket's phrases. Tarun's handwriting on the page with the names. Imran's careful signature. She sketched the path of each on the night they had been taken. A corridor with no marks of a fight. A pillar on a flyover. A back lane with a go-down door. None of it shouted killer. All of it whispered that the killer walked where men did not look up. Asha wrote one more line across the bottom of her sheet. Someone uses the announcement to freeze the city. The someone with hands arrives inside that stillness. She closed the files and slid them into a canvas bag arranged by the same order she used for spices at home. She believed in order because chaos is a luxury and murderers count on police to be tired. She checked her watch. The afternoon had shortened. She told the technician at the wing to hold fast and touch nothing. She told the plainclothes officers to rotate in new eyes. She told the constable with soft shoes to find out how many white vans had been sold secondhand in the last 6 months, within 2 postal codes of the floodplain road. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the station again, where announcements in the official voice told trains to do what trains always do. She listened to the rhythm and stress of the phrases. She listened to the hiss in the gaps. She heard the clothes that had been stolen to dress a threat. She kept walking. Part 5. A voice the city already trusts. The audio lab sat on the 2nd floor of a building that used to sell harmoniums and now sold silence. The room smelled of warm plastic and old paper. A window unit pushed tired air across a table where machines waited with their small eyes lit. The technician who had watched the rack through the night had handed the baton to a colleague with a cleaner shirt and the same careful hands. Asha placed the field recorder on the table as if placing down a cup too full to spill. They played the capture once without touching the dials. The voice entered like a train that never showed its headlight. The sentence rose and fell with the familiar posture of announcement language, the kind that carries a city across a platform without ever leaving a footprint. The new technician tilted his head and let his face smooth into attention. He had the look of a man who did not try to impress sound. He tried to learn it. He looped the line and applied a gentle stretch to the timeline so that the seconds unspooled like thread. The room filled with shapes. The waveform showed a short rise when the mouth opened, a plateau when consonants stamped their feet, and a taper when vowels drifted back into the dark. He placed small flags at places a human ear might not bother to name. Breath, syllable boundary, noise floor. He zoomed again. There it was. The seam Asha had heard in her bones when the night was still. A fall in the hiss that did not belong to this room or any honest room. The technician isolated it and nodded. He spoke to the screen because men who love work often forget to address people. He said that a splice had pulled 2 pieces of audio together and dressed the cut with a layer of noise to keep the ear from tripping. He said whoever had done it knew the smell of old public address systems. The hiss carried the frequency of horn speakers in large halls. It was like mixing dust into new paint to match a wall that has known hands. He scrubbed backward to the first name. He ran a spectral view that showed sound not as waves but as color layered across frequency. The vowels wore the fat colors of crowded halls. The highest sounds had a thin bright ribbon that did not quite match the lower bands. The last syllable of the surname had the tiniest trace of a different room tone, a pocket of space with a shorter tail. He pointed with a pencil and made a small click with his tongue. He said 2 rooms had been joined. He said the cut was good enough to fool a city that did not expect cruelty from a loudspeaker. Asha asked for a layman's version so she could use it with a prosecutor who would have loved to be a musician and had become a lawyer instead. The technician smiled without showing teeth. He said someone had built the sentence from pieces. They had taken Na from a real announcement that happened to say a word like Nagpur or Nayanagar. They had taken Aina from another sample. They had glued them with care and covered the glue with a filter that said, "Do not mind me. I have always been here." The work was not synthetic speech. It was a mosaic. It was patience. He took the capture apart farther. Each consonant showed its edges like buildings against the sky. Between them, small islands of nothing carried fingerprints of rooms. The technician tapped 3 spots on the screen and marked them. He said those 3 islands matched a sample he had in a library of old recordings taken from New Delhi railway station a year ago, back before the wing had closed. He loaded the library sample and played it under the captured sentence at low volume. The hiss married perfectly. The spine of the sound was the same. Whoever had built the voice had stolen the room as well as the mouth. Asha asked him to write that sentence down. He did, and his hand was as neat as his work. A young assistant in a sweater too warm for the day brought a portable magnifier and set it on the table next to the recorder without asking why. The technician unrolled a pouch and took out a plastic pick. He looked to Asha. She nodded. He turned the field recorder over and opened the battery compartment. He did not want the obvious places. He wanted the places where a person with bad intentions and good hands would hide a breadcrumb. He found it under the rubber foot. The foot came away with a soft, unwilling sound. The sticky beneath held a sliver of plastic the size of a fingernail. It was not from the recorder. It was a cap from a small storage device. The cap had been pressed into the glue and then stuck there when the device itself was slid out in a hurry. He lifted it with tweezers and set it in a clean dish. He did not smile because he had learned not to love a single clue until it had brought friends. Asha felt the small click that comes when a pattern admits a detail that fits. If a cap had stayed behind, its companion had been here. It could have been presented to the recorder for copying, then removed, or it could have belonged to the rack itself. She did not want to guess for too long from one bit of plastic. She told the assistant to search the equipment room again with hands that could read under shelves and behind brackets. She told him to bring anything that felt like a thumb drive or looked like something a careful person would never admit to owning. The assistant left and returned after an hour with a paper envelope that made almost no sound. Inside was a small metal drive the color of cleaned coin. The end wore a piece of tape that had been cut with a dull scissors. The tape had trapped a line of dust. On the tape someone had written 2 letters that would not mean much to anyone who did not want them to mean anything. Pa. The technician did not plug the drive into his machine. He slid it into a read-only hardware adapter that lived in a drawer for days exactly like this one. He nodded to Asha. She turned on the body camera she favored for her own habit of record. He mounted the adapter and let the machine make its private decision to show its contents. The drive held folders that were not named like sins. They were named like errands. Numbers stood beside numbers. Inside the folders lived hundreds of audio files. Each file was no longer than a blink, a single syllable, a single breath. Each was tagged with a pair of letters for the likely phoneme and a number that meant the order in which a careful mind had taken it. The mind had stripped the identity off the speakers and kept the meat of the sound. He sampled a handful at random. The same woman's tone met them from different days and different announcements. Station names, numbers, honorifics. The technician found a miniature of the capture in a set of test lines. A half-finished name, practice place. The pieces smelled of sweat and care. You do not scrape a voice like this without spending hours hunched over a keyboard, letting your ears become the only window in the world. They opened a text file at the root of the drive. The notes were sparse. There were references to simple scripts for stepping through syllables and exporting finished lines with a standard dose of public address hiss overlaid. The filter was narrowband, the kind used to make new recordings feel older by cutting breath and leaving muscle. The notes were written in a hand that had learned its letters on ruled pages. The English was correct but workmanlike. There were no jokes. There was one line that read, "When you dress it like the station the ear obeys." The technician leaned back and let the chair complain. He said this was not a child's prank. This was a hobby turned to a craft turned to an instrument. He said the person who built it knew the city's trust belonged to certain vowels and a certain rhythm. He said the person had given that trust a new task and told it to frighten people into staying small. Asha kept her mind on the path. The drive would go to evidence. The filter design would go into her notes as a phrase a prosecutor could wear in court without stumbling. She asked the technician to print a spectrogram that showed the splice seams without horror. He did. The color story was clear even to an untrained eye. One room ended. Another began. A dressing of hiss brushed over the join. The result could walk into a station and be accepted as a cousin who had always belonged. The door opened. The assistant who had found the drive stepped in with a small sachet of screws and a single bent resistor he had pried from the floor under the rack. He said it must have been dropped during the work. The resistor wore a thin red paint smudged the color of old primer. Asha thought of the relay soldered across the mute line and the cloth tape with the serrated tongue. The story had a texture now. Not only the kind of part, but the kind of shop where the part had been bought. Not only what had been done, but where the hands liked to stand while doing it. Asha's phone vibrated against her palm. The constable with soft shoes had a message. A traffic camera near the floodplain had caught the white van again 3 nights in a row at exactly 10 minutes before the horn speakers had spoken. Logos faded on the side panels. The plates had been copied, enhanced, cleaned. The number returned to a small electronics shop that did repairs for neighborhood clinics and installed security cameras for grocers who could not afford a full guard. The proprietor's name was familiar from a different list. A former rail signal engineer. Dismissed after a stampede inquiry. Now he sold boxes and wires and the feeling of safety. Asha did not say the name aloud in the lab. She wrote it in her notebook and underlined it once. She asked the technician to package the drive and the prints. She asked the assistant to take the resistor to the trace lab and see if the paint matched any known primer used by small workshops in the market lanes near the river. She asked the city for one more favor. That the next hour would give her permission to act. The lab fell back into its patient sounds. The looped sentence kept its strange dignity as it went around and around. The woman's voice did not know it had been turned to a blade. It only knew how to tell a crowd where to stand and when to board. Asha watched the spectrogram soften as the screen dimmed to protect its own life. She closed her notebook. The city trusted a certain kind of instruction. Someone had borrowed that trust and told it to do harm. She had the shape of the borrowed thing in her hand now. She would follow the wire to the person who had tied it to the horn speakers and called it necessary. She left the lab and walked into the corridor where the walls had learned to carry echoes. The building's stairwell sang with footsteps that did not belong to her. On the landing, a neon strip fizzed and came back to itself. The day outside was white and hot and full of voices. All of them believed their own sentences. Asha believed in evidence and in the stubborn habit of machines. She headed for the next door on her list. Part 6, people with keys, people with wires. The shop on the license sat between a photocopy stall and a watch repair table that had learned to tell time by the sun. A tin sign said Surrey Security and Service in letters that had once been proud. Inside, power strips hung like pale vines and camera housings stared with dead pupils from hooks along the wall. The floor had the feel of a place that cleaned only the middle, leaving the edges to keep the history. Parth Suri stood behind the counter in a shirt that had known better seasons. He had the posture of a man who had spent years listening to small machines and had taught his body to turn with them. On a shelf behind his right shoulder, a row of boxes held the words intercom, paging, gateway, and a brand that had sold itself to buildings that wanted to pretend they were careful. Asha did not introduce the reason she was here. She asked for a receipt book. He showed it, hands still. She asked for his log of wholesale orders. He slid it forward, the ink faint where the pen had skipped. She asked what he had sold to clinics in the last 6 months. He answered by reading out what the lines said without coloring them with excuses. A paging amplifier for a clinic on Roopnagar Road. a small speaker set for a dentist, 3 cameras for a grocer whose cousin had been robbed. Nothing that was a crime by itself. Everything that could be used by one. The bell on the door rang when a boy came in with a dead doorbell. Suri did the work of a shopkeeper for 2 minutes, then nudged the bell back toward life and sent the boy out lighter by a few coins. When the door closed again, Asha said the words that changed a room. She told him his van had been seen near the floodplain at a time when no one needed to be there unless they were training dogs or making mistakes. She told him his plate number. She told him that this station kept better eyes than it admitted. He did not start. He did not run. He did not ask for a lawyer. He let his face do nothing for 3 seconds. Then he told a story about testing a booster unit for a clinic that complained of drop calls, the kind of patient tale a man like him would be able to tell while half asleep. It was not impossible. It was not true enough to live through the day. Asha asked, without raising her voice, if he had ever worked near the railways. He said he had, his tone flattening as if he were answering a form. He had been a signal engineer, yes. He had lost that job after an inquiry, yes. He had set up his shop with a loan and a family who had stopped answering his calls when people began to whisper that he would bring the same luck to their days. He did not say the word stampede. He did not say the words his daughter. He let the room keep those words. The room already knew them. She asked to see the back. He hesitated and then led her through a curtain that had been washed too often to pretend to be anything but cloth. The rear of the shop was a mouth of shelves and a table with a soldering iron that had burned its circle into the wood. Jars held screws sorted by ambition. On a pegboard, coils of cable hung obediently. There was a stool where a person could sit for hours and make a small thing do a big job. She let her eyes belong to the details. A primer tin with a cracked lid, red paint dried in teeth marks at the rim, a roll of cloth tape with a serrated tongue where someone had torn it free without a blade. In a shallow tray near the soldering iron lay a relay of the same family as the one pasted across the mute in the rack. On a shelf, a box that had once held an audio gateway sat open, its foam cutout shaped like an absence. It was an honest room that had taught itself to lie. Asha did not seize anything. Not yet. She took photographs because the present likes to forget. She asked for invoices for the boxes on the shelf and pretended to be picky about brands. He answered because he was a man trained to be precise when talking about parts. She watched him because sometimes precision is a confession dressed as work. When she left the shop, she stood in the lane and let the heat draw a line along her scalp. She called the team and set a watch on Suri, a watch that looked like 2 men choosing a place for tea and 1 woman arguing with a tailor over the price of cloth. Then she turned to the next name on her list. Mira Anand lived in a 1-room flat whose window faced a wall painted the color of late limes. The room held a desk with a cheap foam panel tacked above it to make a corner of silence. A condenser microphone sat on a stand with a pop filter, the kind used by people who teach pronunciation to strangers over the internet. A second-hand computer wore headphones like an old man hoping he had chosen the right hat. Mira opened the door with eyes that calculated whether Asha would be a customer or a collector. Asha showed her card and watched Mira make the small change that women make when they understand that today will not go as planned. Mira said she did freelance work. She trained voice assistants to behave. She corrected advertising voice tracks for grammar. Once, years ago, she had recorded a sample reel for the railways and had not been called back. It still made her laugh if she could make herself laugh. Asha looked at the desk. A list of common Indian names lay handwritten on a pad. Next to each name, small marks indicated syllable breaks. At the bottom, a neat line of place names with their local stress pattern marked in slashes and circles. The work could have belonged to a person who taught elocution. It could have belonged to someone slicing sound into pieces and then reassembling it so it would pass for something the city already trusted. Mira saw Asha's eyes on the list and did not try to cover it. She folded her arms and then unfolded them, a person putting her hands back where they could do less harm. She said she had been paid for small jobs by a man who ran an electronics shop, a man who had told her he was building a demo to sell a public address solution to clinics and schools. He had sent her files. He had asked her to record missing bits when the public samples did not give him the right shape of sound. He had paid cash. He had not told her where any of it would be played. Asha asked for the messages. Mira opened her phone with a shake in her fingers she did not try to hide. The messages were brief and without sentiment. They used phrases like "need clean K-sound" and "send Carol in neutral stress." A bank deposit a week earlier showed a transfer from a business name that mapped to a general storefront registered in a cousin's name. Not large sums. Enough to make rent and to stop the kind of thoughts that take people into debts that end with men outside the door. Asha did not tell Mira to feel guilty. She took a photograph of the list and the pad and the foam panel because even the tools of innocence can be used to prove a method. She asked Mira to come to the station to make a statement. Mira nodded as if she had expected to be chosen for something sooner or later, and this would be as good a choice as any other. She put on sandals and took her phone and locked the door and did not look back. The third name on Asha's list wore a nickname like a blade tucked into a boot. Rakesh Johar, known as Raku, belonged to the lanes around Sadar Bazaar the way a horn belongs to a vehicle. People knew where he was even when they could not see him because they felt the way talk bent around him. His men liked to stand with perfect posture in front of shutters as if saluting the concrete. Raku kept a scooter with a tuned exhaust that made a sound like a growl even at idle. He kept 3 numbers active at any time and changed them when they began to feel unlucky. He moved money through fronts owned by cousins of cousins who believed in family and in fear equally. He liked to visit go-downs late, when a man can put a hand on the back of another man's neck and tilt his head and call it conversation. Asha did not walk into his lane. She sent the plainclothes officer with the soft shoes to count the vehicles, to read the tire cuts, to listen to the exhaust notes as they passed like birds whose names he knew. She asked him to note who Raku greeted and who he ignored, and whether the bikes went quiet at 2:15 on nights when the horn speakers woke. The officer called with a report that sounded like the beginning of a poem and ended like a charge sheet. He had seen Raku's bike near 2 places that now belonged to photographs in Asha's file. He had watched the man's phone go dark exactly when the city's clocks moved toward the minute the horn speakers lived for. He had watched the man's patience hold until the second hand crossed, then unwind the way a watch spring does when it is allowed to complete its purpose. Asha wrote that down. She drew a line from Raku to the dead and to the nearly dead. She drew another from Raku to Mira through the cash from the general storefront that wore a family name. She drew a third from Raku to Suri through the van that sat by the river like a patient prayer. The last name on her list did not belong to an idea. It belonged to a key. Raghuvir Talwar had a face like a square. He had been a maintenance contractor for a decade and had kept a ring of keys like a jailer keeps a song. After the southern wing closed, some keys had been returned and some had been hung on a nail in a room that no one visited. Raghuvir worked the night shift on the living platforms and held himself as if the city had to ask his permission to pass. Asha found him at a tea stall where men who work near rails take their sweet strong medicine. He had the permanent dust of ballast on his shoes. He spoke in the slow baritone of a man who had learned not to hurry in front of officers. When she asked about the closed wing, he said the locks were old and stubborn, not worth oil anymore. When she asked who had the keys, he said the railways had them. When she asked if any had been copied, he gave the answer men give when they do not want to be part of any story that might earn them a night without sleep. He said he did not know. She noticed the shape of the key on his ring that did not match the others. She noticed the polish on one tooth from use that had continued past the closing day. She did not take it from his belt. She asked him if he would bring a set to the station to be photographed and logged for a maintenance audit. She used language that would keep his pride intact. He agreed because the word audit wraps itself in the flag of necessity. By evening, her board had lines she trusted and faces she could place on a street. The shopkeeper with a past that hurt, who owned a van and a box-shaped absence. The voice worker who had cut names into pieces and given them back smooth, who had been paid by a front with a family name. The racketeer whose hours were measured by fear, who let his bike idle like a promise. The contractor with a ring of keys and a tooth that shone where a lock had kept asking to be turned. She stood at the window of her office and watched the sky pretend it would cool soon. She called her team and told them to prepare for a simple act. She wanted a night of eyes on the floodplain, another on the lanes of Parganj and Sadar Bazaar, and a pair of hands ready to pull a van to the curb with courtesy that would not survive refusal. She wanted Mira in an interview room where sound was measured and words were pinned to paper. She wanted Suri to feel a shadow that followed him into the back room and stood near the soldering iron. She wanted Raku to learn that there are nights when the city's fear does not belong to him. Then she sat and wrote the line that would tie the hour to the case. Cross names with call records and device buys. Put wires on the map with hands attached. The voice is a tool. The murders are a schedule. Tonight we take the clock apart. Part 7, 02:17's phone. By nightfall the river had the color of metal left in rain. The floodplain smelled of warm silt and the kind of grass that survives by pretending to be asleep. Asha stood beside an unmarked car on a service road that no tourist would ever find, looking at a strip of asphalt where tire marks braided and unbraided like black rope. She had in her pocket 3 things she trusted. A court order for call detail records tied to a small card in a small gateway. A second order for a vehicle stop and search. A printout of towers that carried the weight of a call at 2:17 on 3 different nights. She had watched the map grow its own spine through the day. Each 2:17 call had opened a cell on the east bank. The tower sectors faced the river like narrow eyes. The handoff pattern said a caller who did not like tall buildings. The timing said a caller who kept a clock that could shave itself with a knife. The number on the audio gateway's card had 3 friends that kept showing up as cousins on the network's register for an hour before the minute. The friends were prepaid and polite, active just long enough to announce their loyalty, then switched off like moths under a heel. Asha let her plainclothes team settle themselves into the landscape. One sat with a fishing rod that would never see water. One stood with a shoulder against a concrete pillar as if arguing with the world in a tired way. One leaned on a parked motorcycle and practiced the art of belonging by doing nothing. They had learned the river's grammar with their bodies. They were commas, not exclamation points. 20 minutes to 2. A white van rolled into the turnout with the patience of someone who had measured distance by the yard and the second. The panels were ghosted with the memory of an old logo scrubbed off with solvent. The rear windows wore film that would not stand up in sun. The van took its place facing the road as if it had been assigned that place by an invisible instructor. It idled. It listened to its own heart. Asha did not move. She spoke 2 low words on the radio and heard them echoed without fuss. The nearest unit came away from the pillar and drifted to a position where a person might choose to stretch their back. Another unit unsnapped a small camera and took a breath as if beginning to whistle. The motorcycle leaned a little closer to the exit lane. Silence thickened the way milk thickens in tea, quietly, as if this had always been the plan. At 2:12, the van's interior light blinked on and off. A man's shape leaned over from the driver's seat to the passenger footwell. Hands moved in small exact motions. Asha could picture the kit without seeing it. A booster with a coiled antenna to wake weak signals. A laptop whose battery had been trained to behave. A pocket router that believed in nothing but work. A phone placed in a stand with a clock open, set to an hour and a minute that had been chosen not for poetry but for force. At 2:15, the van's idle rose for a breath and settled. The driver stayed small. The light inside remained off. Asha checked her watch. She did not need to. Her bones could have told her the same story. At 2:16, the man in the van lifted his head. He did not look at the river. He looked at the road as if the road could give him permission. He raised a phone to his ear and then set it on the dash, speaker pointed up. The laptop's lid opened a few degrees more like a lip. The coils of the booster stood up straighter the way a dog's ears do when a sound it loves returns. The minute completed itself. At 2:17, the van called the rack in the shuttered wing, and the closed wing answered like a faithful servant. The horn speakers in that dead corridor took a breath and said a name somewhere behind Asha's shoulder in the city's hot dark. Asha listened instead to the river insects and to the small change in the van's posture. The call ran out. The man in the van did not smile. He did not relax. He shut things down with the motions of a person who knows that the only reward for one good operation is the chance to prepare the next. Asha spoke the word now and the world near the van shifted its shape. The motorcycle became a barrier. The fisher folded his rod with surprising efficiency and stepped into the lane. The tired arguer by the pillar developed authority. Two more figures materialized from grass like men who had grown out of the river itself. There was no chase. The driver reached for the gear lever out of habit and found a palm at the window and a face that had arrived without anger and without doubt. They opened the door and asked him to step out. He asked if he was under arrest and pronounced the words as if he had practiced them. Asha showed him the paper with the judge's name where it needed to be and the stamp the color of old cherries. She said he was being detained on suspicion of unlawful access to communications equipment, intimidation by threat, and conspiracy to commit violence. He took the words into himself like tablets he would store for later. He tried a smile and failed. Then he stepped out. He left behind the smell of hot electronics and a long, soft breath the van had been holding for him. The search began as a lesson in calm inventory. On the passenger footwell sat a small laptop whose stickers had been peeled off with a fingernail. The desktop, when woken, had a folder named in the way people name a thing they want not to feel ashamed of. Work. Inside were subfolders whose names did not blush. Lines. Strings. Announce. Asha kept her hands behind her back and directed the photographs. A built tool named PA call sat on the desktop like a square door. The app's icon was a horn speaker drawn with a steady line. The log, when opened, showed 3 dates and 3 times at 2:17 with entries that read delivered. On the rear bench lay a plastic crate with compartments like a fishing box. In each space, a small card in a plastic sleeve sat upright. Prepaid. Each labeled with a date and a short note in a hand that did not like loops. A second crate held power banks and a coil of cokes with its connectors protected by bits of tape. The booster wore a brand that had been sold in the city forever and meant only that the user knew which antis of radio could be trusted. There was a map folded and refolded until the creases had become geography. They laid the items on a cloth on the turnout dirt, as if preparing to show a reasonable man the tools of his trade. The driver watched, going paler by degrees as though someone had turned down the rheostat on his skin. When Asha said his name, he flinched not at the sound of it, but at the sound of it in a voice that did not plan to be fooled. "Parth Suri," she said, and he blinked once, very slowly, as if waking from a short nap and finding a different ceiling. He tried a story about testing equipment for a clinic with bad reception. Patrol had heard that story already in his shop that afternoon. It did not age well. Asha picked up the laptop without touching the keyboard and read out a line from the application's documentation visible through the glass of the screen. It said route audio to gateway, select target, inject hiss, deliver. The words were not criminal by themselves. Together with a closed wing that should have slept, they began to sing a different tune. They moved him and the van back to the station with the quiet choreography that keeps a city from waking when it does not need to. In the interview room, Parth sat with his hands folded, as if he remembered a childhood that made folding hands feel like protection. Asha did not push. She set the laptop on the table but did not open it again. She let him look at the plastic crate of cards and the booster on the cart and the photograph of the vent behind which a little panel drank sun. He asked if she knew what it was like to be standing in a crowd and understand that a small wrong decision made by a man with a lever has turned the air into a weapon. He did not say stampede. He did not say the name of the day. He did not say the name of the person he had lost. But he put the shape of those things in the room like furniture. Asha said she understood that people carry losses until they try to turn the city into a voice for those losses. She said a public address system is a machine for trust. Tells people where to stand and when to move. She said someone had taken that trust and fed it names and told it to scare witnesses into silence. She watched his face when she said witnesses. He closed his eyes for a second as if reading a line written on the inside of his lids. She showed him a printout of the spectrogram that proved the seams. She showed him the photograph of the drive labeled with 2 letters. She showed him the log file that read delivered. She did not raise her voice. She did not give him the relief of anger. He said the system was a warning. He said he wanted to frighten the men who kneel on necks in alleys. He said the police do nothing until the city screams. He said he had given the city a way to scream in a register that officials could not ignore. He did not ask who had joined his warnings to deaths. He did not need to. The fear in the room had its own address and wore a leather jacket and a grin that left no heat in the eyes. Asha listened the way she listened to machines. For irregular hum. For a scrape that meant a wire had been laid wrong. She heard two truths in his sentence and one lie. He had built it. He had told himself it was a warning. He had known, once the first body fell, that someone else was using his clock to do a different kind of work, and he had continued because stopping would have meant taking back responsibility he had given to a machine. She stepped out of the room and let the door close softly. In the hall, the technician from the audio lab stood with a printed list of the numbers whitelist on the gateway. Asha skimmed. The most recent at the top had a note, a single letter M next to it in the same hand that named folders like errands. Mira. There were two numbers below that whose notes were shapes rather than letters. She knew one shape. It was the careless serif tail Raku sometimes added to his first initial when he signed for deliveries at the go-down. She went back in. She placed the list of numbers within Parth's reach but not within his hand. She put a pen beside it and said nothing. The pen lay like a small weapon he had been offered. He stared at it until his eyes stopped focusing. He said he had meant to scare men away from hurting people who talked. He said the first time, when a body fell after the horn spoke, he had believed that it was a coincidence with good timing, a freakish rhyme. The second time he had known that someone had heard the horn and used it as cover. The third time he had told himself that sometimes you must burn a field to kill the pests. The sentence did not fit his mouth. It sat in the air between them like something borrowed. Asha said the field had names. She said the pests had knives and bikes and a schedule. She said the horn speaker was not a god. It was a machine with a number. She said she would take his van and his laptop and his cards and his voice. She said he could help decide whether he would also carry the names of the dead. He breathed. He asked for water. He said a name he had not written anywhere. A woman in a room that had once sold toys to parents. A daughter. Asha listened and let the wave lift and pass. Then she asked him to write down every number he had added to the gateway's whitelist and every person who had stood behind him while he did it. He picked up the pen and began to write, not because he had decided to be noble, but because evidence makes its own weather, and he had finally stepped into the rain. Part 8: The Knife and the Clock. The station's evening ran along rails of habit. Vendors called and were answered. Shoes struck stone like metronomes. Somewhere a porter laughed because laughing keeps the body from remembering too much. In the crime branch, under dull lights that made faces honest, Asha laid timelines end to end until they touched and began to behave. She pinned 3 clocks to a board. The horn spoke at 2:17. Bodies were discovered between 4:05 and 5:20. In between, the city held its breath. She wrote the minutes when each victim was last seen alive. She wrote the minutes when certain phones went dark. She marked 2 intervals with red pencil. The period when the man with the van was still parked by the floodplain. The period when a bike with a tuned exhaust moved from lane to lane like a rumor. She called the call detail records out loud as if reading a litany. Parth's prepaid numbers pulsed awake at 2:10, called one target number at 2:17, went silent at 2:18. Raku's primary number blinked out at 2:15 on 3 nights, came back at 3:12, then went dark again until sunrise. The second number tied to him followed the same tide. The white line of Mira's number matched the days she had worked, a steady slope that did not venture near 2:17. The contractor's line drifted through midnight shifts without ever touching that minute. The patterns were clean. The blood was not. Traffic cameras, poor instruments at night, offered small gifts. A single frame showed Raku's bike 2 lanes from the flyover where Tarun had been found, the cut in the rear tire drawing a broken diagonal across a fuzzy circle. Another frame caught the headlamp signature near a go-down at Sadr Bazaar, the hot white center of an aftermarket bulb and a throat of shadow around it like a personal eclipse. Asha enlarged both frames until they became geometry and laid them beside photographs from the scenes. She measured angles with a cheap protractor because cheap tools, too, tell truths. The constable with soft shoes returned with a sheaf of notes that sounded like evening in Sadr Bazaar. Raku had been seen near the alley behind a clinic twice in the last month. Once smoking a cigarette he never finished. once staring at a fixed point in the air as if waiting for a cue only he could hear. He had a habit of looking up at metal loudspeakers whenever he passed them, as if measuring their honesty. On nights when the horn spoke, the lanes near Parganj and Nabi Karim went quieter than usual. Men who normally quarreled over space learned to be polite with silence. Asha wrote a sentence at the bottom of the board. The announcement freezes lanes. The murders move inside the freeze. She printed a simple map of each victim's last hour, then traced an imagined path for a killer whose ambition was to be invisible. No showy detours. No mess. If fear is the tool works best when the city is too frightened to ask why a man is walking past at 2 in the morning. The horn speaks. Doors close. Phones go under pillows. A bike rolls by like a slow drum. A knock. A chemical pressed into a cloth. A thumb on a neck. A body lowered as if it had been told bedtime had come early. Asha stepped into evidence to feel its temperature. The cloth from Ria's back room still held a sweet sting even after Air had argued with it for days. The paper cup from Tarun's desk still wore the print of a thumb older than that morning. The porter's cap, battered and proud, still carried the oily shine of work. She looked for the thing that belonged to the murderer. She found only the shape of his schedule. She returned to the interview rooms. Mira sat with her hands wrapped around a cup she had not sipped from. Her voice had found its level before a recorder and had told the story again in the plain terms of a person who wants the harm to have limits. She had sliced names into syllables on request. She had been paid cash through a storefront 2 lanes from a produce wholesaler that moved goods the color of dusty emeralds. She had never stepped into the shuttered wing. She had not sat in the van by the river. She had not heard the horn in real time until last night when a neighbor sent her a recording with a laughing message that did not know laughter could sit next to a grave. Asha let her go home with instructions not to travel and a promise someone would watch the building from across the street. Mira carried her microphone like a child carries a doll after learning that dolls can break. Parth sat in another room under light that asked for the truth by being boring. He had written down the list of numbers he had whitelisted. He had drawn small check marks next to 2 that belonged to Raku. He had stared a long time at one number that had no note, then put the letter R in the margin because he had grown tired of lying to himself. When Asha asked, again, why he had continued after the first murder, he said he had believed that loud noises make men change. He had sketched a circle. He had called the horn a siren to wake sleepers. He had refused to say who the sleepers were and what they had done to his life. He had not eaten the food on the metal tray. Asha stepped out and washed her hands as if the day had left a film on them. In the corridor, the technician from the lab waited with a printout of the filter routine lifted from the drive labeled PA. He spoke in the tidy way of a man who believes that truth is the best persuasion. He said a narrow band filter had been applied to the spliced syllables to add the signature hiss of a large hall. He said the author had not attempted synthetic speech. He said the ear obeys familiar noise, and the person who built the voice had used that obedience like a key. Asha thanked him because work deserves witness. The hour bent toward midnight. Asha stood before the board and saw the trap take shape in the glass. She could arrest Raku on his record, drag him in by the scruff of a dozen small intimidations. She could charge Parth and Mira. The city would applaud in the way a city applauds when bodies are moved off the stage before morning. But she wanted the clock itself on camera. She wanted motion, plan, knife, cloth. She wanted the man who believed in schedules to be caught by one. She made a plan simple enough to behave. First, leave the audio gateway in the rack untouched. Let the closed wing present its same face. Second, set the gateway to auto-answer at 217 as usual, but add a shadow in the line. Have the rack recording loop prepared to play at that moment regardless of incoming audio, if and only if the incoming caller matched one of the whitelist numbers still in play. Third, craft a line for the horn that would trip both men at once. Not a wail, not a warning, a name that pointed like a blade. She chose the name deliberately, Rakesh Johar. She chose a place that would pull him across town like a magnet he did not believe in. Parganj. A name that made him picture certain alleys and certain shutters and a certain shopkeeper who had been told to keep quiet and had not listened. She did not debate whether this was fair. Justice is practical or it becomes a sermon no one hears. She called the officers who had learned the floodplain and told them to let the van park tonight as it had parked before. She assigned a pair to the north lanes, a pair to the west, and a net of plainclothes to tie corners together. She requisitioned a single car with unmarked lights and told its driver to wait. Engine off. Nose pointed toward the thick of Pargange where east streets squeeze into west. She briefed her team in a voice that belonged to Rain. They would not rush the floodplain. They would not scare a man who loved his routines into abandoning them. They would let the call land. They would let the horn speak. They would move on the lanes where knives prefer to work, the way one moves on a snake. No one would play hero. Heroes are for songs and memorials. This was a case. Before she left the room, she made one more circuit through evidence. She took the cloth from Ria's file and held it without flinching, and then put it back where it belonged. She looked at the porter's cap and said his name. She tapped the page where Tarun's handwriting had stopped mid-word. She closed the files with the finality that families beg the police to achieve. The city rolled forward into its midnight. Asha returned to the southern wing. The guard nodded from his stool, as if he had been waiting the whole time to tell her that the building had kept its small promise to stay still. The technician settled himself near the rack again, the recorders alive but modest. Asha climbed the ladder to the horn speakers and looked into their mouths as if she were checking a patient who refuses to admit his teeth hurt. She descended. She wrote in her book the sentence that would be her lead out. Parth built the oracle. Raku uses it to time his moves. Set a sting that forces both clocks to strike together. She took her place at the equipment room threshold. She watched the second hand walk toward the minute the city had been taught to fear. Around her the closed wing listened. In the distance the river exhaled and a motorbike tested its throat like a singer warming up. The trap waited the way honest traps do, without pride. Part 9. A name that isn't. The shuttered wing breathed the thin breath of old walls. The rack's small fan kept its promise. Outside, the station moved in long strokes. Asha stood with her shoulder near the equipment room frame, notebook shut, attention open. The technician sat with his recorder and the calm of a person who understands that patience is a tool like any other. At 2:10, the plainclothes officer at the floodplain sent a single word. Parked. The white van had taken its old place, nose toward the road, tail to the field, antenna coiled like an insect spine. The river insects answered in their own frequency. The city kept its eyes down. Asha looked up at the cones. She had already taught the rack a second task. The gateway would answer a whitelist number at 2:17 as usual, but the automatic playback would ride the incoming line with its own message if the call came from any of three numbers. It would speak with the same dressed hiss, the same steady posture of the official voice. It would wear the clothes the city had learned to obey. The minute approached. The guard at the door held very still, as if the act of moving would cause time to skip. The technician watched the tiny voltage readout. Asha watched nothing at all and everything at once. The rack woke. The blue slit behind the faceplate glowed. The gateway's light pricked twice and steadied. The speakers took their breath. Rakesh Johar, Pargange. The sentence walked out of the cones with the authority of trains. Every syllable arrived whole, sewn from the same cloth as 100 ordinary announcements. The last word held for a fraction longer, then fell away. The hiss faded. The room returned to being a room. On the far side of the city, the van's driver stared at his dash as if a different voice had spoken his name from under the plastic. He did not speak. He did not call again. He bent over his keyboard for a second, then shrugged off the itch between his shoulder blades and started the engine. He had delivered. The clock had chimed. That was his job. He would fold his wires and go home to a bed he did not sleep in well. The lanes did what fear teaches them. A shutter man with a broom paused mid-sweep and let the handle rest against his shoulder. A mangy dog turned a slow circle and lay down as if hoping to become a doorstop. A tea boy put 2 cups upside down on a shelf like a charm. The horn had spoken a name. The name belonged to a man who walked with his chin up and his hand loose. The name belonged to trouble. Doors listened to their hinges. Raku heard it in the half-sleep of a man who lives inside the night. He sat up before the last vowel ended. He wore habit instead of armor. He palmed his knife to feel its weight, then tucked it back where it rode well. He told his rider to wake and did not repeat the instruction. He put a rag and a bottle in a small satchel that had already learned the shape of both. He checked his watch out of pride, not need. He liked to beat schedules by seconds. He rolled the bike out with the engine off until the lane widened enough to swallow noise. Then he thumbed the starter and let the tuned exhaust clear its throat. The rider climbed on behind him with a nervous heel tapping the pipe. Raku took the north cut and slid into a road that led toward Parganj like a sentence leads toward a period. He did not hurry. He did not dawdle. He rode like a man who believes the city belongs to people who move as if they own it. Plainclothes units peeled into the alley grid ahead of him. 2 to a corner. 1 to the market mouth. 1 to the curve where the lane narrows to a squeeze and men must slow to keep their knees. Officers in ordinary shirts made offered space and watched the angle of coming light on chrome. Asha left the equipment room as soon as the last S of Parganj had died. She took the side stairs and walked through the concourse without bending to the life around her. In the car outside, the driver watched her in the rear view without trying to guess her thoughts. She told him to go slow and not to change his face. He did both with the talent of a man who had been invisible once and had enjoyed it. They reached the mouth of Parganj where signs fought for air on both sides of the road. Neon had not been kind to the place. It had taught the walls how to lie about color. Asha stepped out and smelled hot oil cooling, sweet rot in a drain, and the thin chemic note that had begun to stitch its thread through this case. She took her position where she could see the approach without becoming part of it. 2 officers relaxed in the shadow of a closed travel office. One checked his phone and did not read it. The bike came on in a straight line, as if the street had been measured with a ruler in his head. Raku's chin was up, his mouth set. The rider's eyes moved too fast, chewing the edges of every doorway they passed. A shutter to the left wore a fresh smear of paint. A sign above a clinic door flickered and held. A plastic chair waited in the wrong place like a dog tied and forgotten. Asha raised one hand and let it sink again. On the right, an unmarked car eased forward. In the mirror of a shop, a plainclothes officer touched his ear. Raku glanced at nothing and at everything, and then the street changed shape under him. The car closed behind. The officers stepped off the wall. The narrowed lane ahead held 2 men who had not been there a second earlier. The rider had time to hiss one syllable that could have been prayer or profanity. Raku braked without losing balance. His boot hit the ground, found grit, and held. His left hand reached. The knife flashed a sliver of dull light. The cloth and bottle stayed in the satchel for the moment, which meant there would be no excuse about tools for cleaning. Asha walked in from the side as if joining a friend. Her eyes were on his eyes, not on the blade. She told him her name and the charge. She told him to open his hand and let the knife become the problem of the earth. He looked at her and measured the distance to everything. He was good at measuring. He had lived this long by knowing where weight stood in a room. He let the knife tilt. He considered making a scene. He saw around him a collection of faces that did not want to fight, not out of mercy, but out of a discipline as cold as metal. He let the knife drop. It clinked against the road as if objecting to the way its story had ended. Hands moved. The rider tried a push and found a forearm where he had expected no one. The satchel slid free and lay on the ground like a confession already opened. They catalogued on the spot because mornings have a way of erasing details if you leave them to memory. The knife was small and workmanlike, its handle taped against sweat. The bottle held the ghost of a chemical that could turn breath into sleep with 2 folded seconds. A pair of surgical masks lay under the bottle, as if respectability were a costume to be put on after harm, not before. In a side pocket, a roll of tape had the same serrated tongue Asha had seen at Suri's bench. Raku looked from the knife to the bottle to the tape and back to Asha's face. He met someone there who did not intend to be outlasted. He tried a smile that had gotten him into courtyards and out of charges before. Found no purchase here. He looked past her at the horns bolted to a corner pole farther up the lane. Mouths pointed toward the street where errands began every day. He held the look for one heartbeat too long. He was not looking for help. He was measuring the shape of the god that had spoken his schedule aloud. They moved him into the car with a politeness that left no room for dignity. The rider went into another car and began to talk immediately because some men are only brave when they have a driver in front of them. Asha sent one unit to the clinic whose sign had flickered, to knock and note faces. She sent another to the alley to canvass for men who had decided to step outside as soon as the horn spoke. The floodplain unit sent an update. The van had left its turnout and taken the road away from the river at a tidy speed. The driver's posture had not changed. He had put his life back into its crate. The officers trailed him to his lane and then let him go where a warrant would find him again. In the station interview room, Raku chose a chair by instinct and leaned back to test its legs. A camera in the corner made a small red point in the air. He eyed it, weighed it, and looked away. He said nothing at first. Asha let silence go to work. Silence is cheaper than threats and often twice as productive. He spoke sooner than she had guessed. He asked for water and got it. He asked what the charge was, and she told him. He asked how she had known where he would be, and she told him the city itself had read his name. He smirked, but it was a nervous smirk. He said a station was not a person. He said voices do not accuse. He said words from horns are wind. He said he had been on the way to a client who needed goods moved. He did not name the client. He did not explain the bottle. He did not explain why he liked to switch his phone off when the city's loudspeakers came alive. Asha did not give him room to turn the floor into a stage. She placed the satchel on the table and opened it slowly. The chemical spoke with its thin breath. The knife said nothing. She placed a photograph of the godown where Imran had been found. She placed another of the pillar where Tarun had rested in death. She placed the smear of a towel on a shop floor. She let the lane outside the interview room be heard through the window, a murmur that said the day existed and would survive both of them. He looked, and for the first time his eyes changed. They went from the flat of a man performing to the narrow of a man who sees a hole in the path ahead. He said he wanted a lawyer because men like him practice that sentence like a catechism. Asha nodded. She kept her own voice even. She said he would have won. She said while they waited he would sit with her and they would make sure the clock that had been used to frighten a city would not be used again. She stepped out. In the hall, the technician had the rack logs printed. At 2:17, the gateway had received a call from one of the whitelist numbers. The rack had acknowledged. The automatic playback had overridden and delivered the line Asha had written by hand in a notebook before entering it as text in a tool. He passed her the paper. She passed it back and told him to go home and sleep. He smiled like a man who had been given permission to be human again. She called Parth from his room into a second interview. She told him what the horn had said and what had been found in a satchel and what a certain man had been carrying at 2 in the morning. She watched him absorb the shape of what his machine had done when someone else carried the knife. His face sagged not because it had discovered guilt, but because it had discovered a second person in the room when he thought he had been alone with his purpose. He asked for a pen. He wrote 2 names and pushed the paper back. He had begun to understand that warnings that arrive with knives are not warnings. Hands caught. Voice captured. The clock that frightened the lanes now belongs to evidence. Tomorrow will be for division of blame and for the stories people tell themselves to find sleep. Tonight we keep the wire where we can see it and turn toward the room where guilt learns to speak in full sentences. Part 10, Confessions and the Story They Tell Themselves. Morning arrived like a sheet of metal pulled across the sky. The station resumed its language of burdens and arrivals. In the interview rooms where light was always the same, Asha began to separate stories from excuses. She believed in the way truth accumulates, in small grains that finally weigh more than a lie can lift. Raku sat first. He had slept badly for an hour, the kind of sleep that arranges itself on the surface of a man and never reaches his bones. His lawyer appeared with a file and a practiced frown, then asked to confer. They spoke in low voices that tried to borrow privacy from a room that had none to lend. When the talk ran out, the lawyer nodded at Asha as if acknowledging a weather system and said his client would answer certain questions. Asha set the recorder and said the date and the names. Raku watched the red light and avoided it. He spoke in the tone of a man who has measured all his risks and now believes words might move one of them an inch. He said the money flowed through fronts because cash feels cleaner when it touches a till first. He named a cousin's cousin who owned a general store with rectangles of soap in the window. He named a driver who carried envelopes the way other men carry talismans. He said the envelopes were not fat. They were frequent. He said the envelopes kept him in the life he understood and away from the one where he would have to say sir to men who did not deserve it. Asha kept him in the seconds where harm had been timed. Who gave you the names? Who told you when to go? Who told you to carry a cloth instead of a stick? He said no one gave names at first. He said the horn gave names. He said that after the first, people understood that the horn was not to be argued with. He said he tested its power by knocking on doors. He said doors opened to the sound of a known voice, the official voice, the voice the city trusts. He smiled at the craft of it, and then the smile left quickly, embarrassed at having shown itself. He said a fixer with soft hands had sometimes whispered that a witness in a certain ward had grown brave. He said he did not need bravery to do his work. He needed the right minute. He said he had discovered that the right minute arrived after a sentence from a horn that no one had thought to fear before. He said it made the lanes colder. He said it made men fold in on themselves. He said it gave him a path, not because the path was empty, but because it became lined with eyes that had decided not to see. Asha kept him with photographs. The towel on Ria's floor, the pillar under the flyover, the go-down lane where a porter had been told to sleep forever. He did not deny. He leaned forward once, the way men lean when they want to remove a small offense from the air between two people, and then he leaned back because there was no offense small enough to move with that gesture. He said he had done what everybody does. He followed a current. He had just been better at swimming. She asked about Mira. He said he had never met her. He said he had given cash to the general store and the general store had paid a supplier. He said he did not care what voices said his name as long as the sentence arrived on time. He said his work did not require friendship. It required clocks. The lawyer cleared his throat when the words strayed toward confession. Asha moved them to bank slips and transfers that wore dates like bruises. Raku agreed to the shape of them. He denied the intention inside them. He said he had never ordered a death by name. He said he had found opportunities. He said the horn had called and he had answered. He said blame belonged to the voice that frightened doors shut. He was trying to move weight to a machine. Asha closed the notebook, left him with the red light, and crossed the corridor to the second room. Mira sat under the same bulb, a bottle of water open on the table. Her voice, when she began, wore the flatness that comes after a night of repeating a story until it is polished smooth. She said she had cut syllables because syllables pay. She said she had recorded missing pieces in a sound booth made from foam and patience. She said she had added stress marks the way the rail voice does when it wants to be clear over a bad speaker. She said she had learned to copy the breath of big rooms because breath is what teaches the ear to trust. She said she had not imagined the sentences would be thrown at people like stones. She said she had never stood under the horns at 2:17 until the recording drifted to her phone last night. She said she had not slept since. Asha asked her to describe the man who paid her. Mira described a shopkeeper who did not make eye contact until he had to count cash. She described the word demo used like a religious exemption. She described the way he corrected her when she placed stress on the wrong syllable in a place name. She described how he wrote notes in a small tidy hand that made her think of railway timetables. She did not perform her guilt. She offered her skill as evidence. Asha asked for the small lies too. The times she had told herself that this was for schools or clinics. The times she had accepted cash because bank transfers invite questions. Mira named them like stations. She reached the end of the line in a whisper and looked at her own hands as if they had learned to slice voices without asking her. She agreed to testify to the process, to the drive labeled with 2 letters, to the filter that turned a stranger sentence into the city's own. She did not ask to be forgiven. She asked to be involved in the correction. She said she could help explain to a court what a voice is good for and what it is not. Asha believed her for the same reason she believed tools when they are used correctly. Their results are consistent. Parth waited. The third room smelled faintly of solder because the cloth of his shirt carried his shop with him. He looked older than he had the night before. His hands were clean and useless. He asked for the door to remain open. Asha let it stand ajar. Sometimes air matters. He began without prompting, as if time had been rewinding inside him all night and now it had reached the place he needed to confess. He told the story he had avoided saying aloud. A night years ago when he had stood in a crowd at a platform edge. False announcement. A wrong platform posted. A sudden shift of people as a train arrived where it should not have arrived. The sound a crowd makes when it turns from animal to water. The hand he lost in his own hand. The way loud voices had continued to speak timed sentences into the chaos, telling people to mind a gap that had become a mouth. An inquiry that had no room for names. A dismissal that came with a sentence about safety culture that read like a joke translated poorly from a language no one spoke. The shop that followed. The quiet that did not. He said he had built a machine to force the city to listen. He said he had chosen a minute because minutes are things he knows how to hold. He said he had thought fear would move the right people. He said he had fed the machine names to make noise into a knife that cut across sleep. He said he had seen what happened. He had told himself he could not be responsible for other men's hands. He had been a child standing at a lever and had told himself the lever moved the world and not the other way around. Asha let him spill the words. She took them in like bolts and washers that would have to be sorted later. Then she laid the other story on the table beside his. She told him where the van had parked. She told him what the satchel had held. She told him the minute a bike had shut its headlamp off to slide past men who had decided not to see. She told him that his voice had become the air cover for knife and cloth. She told him silence would have done less harm. He nodded, slow and old. He said he had believed that if the city was frightened, it would leave the brave witnesses alone. He said he had not imagined that a man with a knife would find the freeze a blessing. He said he had been wrong and that being wrong would not bring anyone back. He said he had kept going after the first because stopping would have been the same as admitting that he had begun. Asha asked him for the list of numbers again. He wrote them a second time, as if copying a punishment line at school. He added names next to two numbers he had not named before. He added the detail that he had asked Mira for clean syllables when the scraped ones did not yield a certain name, and that he had paid cash through a middleman because he had not wanted to explain to his bank why his outgoings belonged to a project called Public Address. He admitted to the relay across the mute. He admitted the solar trickle. He admitted camouflage for the antenna. Each admission sounded like a screw coming loose under a steady driver. Asha told him the charges as if reading them to the room rather than to him. Conspiracy to intimidate, unlawful access to communications equipment, aiding in the commission of violent acts by providing means and timing, tampering with railway property, creating public panic. She said the murders would sit on other shoulders. She said the law would still find him heavy. He asked for one courtesy. He asked that his daughter's name not be spoken in court. Asha said courts are not instruments of mercy. She said she would ask the prosecutor to keep the human parts free of spectacle. She did not promise anything the court could break. She stepped into the hall and let the building's tired air rinse her face. The board in the incident room now read like a machine diagram. Source of voice, method of splice, hidden power, gateway and whitelist, van on floodplain, knife and cloth, money in envelopes, witnesses named by horn, bodies found in the hours when lanes chose not to look. She assigned charges to files. She called the prosecutor and began to translate machine into human. She called the railways and asked for a representative who would survive the shame of Iraq used like a cudgel. She called the technicians who would certify chain of custody for the drive and the gateway and the relay that forced mute into speech. She called a clerk and asked for more of the dull paper that absorbs ink without bleeding, because cases are built on such paper. By afternoon, statements were signed. Parth's lawyer had persuaded him to stop confessing the same facts twice. Mira had given the phrases that would matter to a judge who needed a bridge from the abstract to the herd. Raku had folded into silence again after running out of the kinds of sentences men like him believe will make police change shape. Asha sat with her notebook and added one line to the end of part 10 in her own map. Machine to murder. Intent to effect. Each person's story carries a self-portrait, but the dead do not get to edit. The court needs a clean chain from voice to knife. We have it. Prepare charges for murder, conspiracy, intimidation, tampering, and unlawful access. Move the case from rooms with humming lights to a room with a raised bench. The horn speakers will not be allowed to speak there. Evidence will. Part 11, Court and the Horn Speakers. The courtroom smelled of old paper and polish. Light fell in rectangles across a floor that had learned to keep footsteps quiet. Asha took her place at the prosecution's table with a stack of folders that looked thin for what they contained. Truth is often lighter than rumor. The judge wore the expression of a man who expected noise and intended to make it leave its shoes at the door. He set the ground early. There would be no talk of hauntings, no invocations of prophecy, no attempts to drape the case in superstition. The charge sheet would speak in ordinary language. Unlawful access to communications equipment, criminal intimidation by broadcast, conspiracy, tampering with railway property, murder. The first witness was a station technician who loved machines more than he loved speaking. The prosecutor led him gently through the pictures Asha had taken. The broken vent, the black panel that drank sun, the thin cable in the wall, the shoebox charger, the battery glued behind the rack face, the component with a gray-sleeved antenna. He explained the gateway as if describing a patient child that answered only to certain callers. He pointed to the relay soldered across the mute line that forced sound through even when the console slept. The judge asked two questions that showed he understood enough to be bored and then nodded. The audio analyst followed. He placed a sheet on an easel and explained the colored bands that made jurors lean forward despite themselves. The splice seams glowed like faults in stone. The analyst explained the narrow band hiss added to dress the cuts in the garments of a station hall. He played a 15-second sample for the court speakers, then the same line without dressing. The difference made even the clerk look up. The judge watched without changing his face. The analyst said the sentence was a mosaic built from hundreds of stolen syllables. He said it was not synthetic speech. He said it was patience and intent turned into a voice the city already trusted. Chain of custody moved like a metronome. The drive with 2 letters on its tape. The read-only adapter. The folder structure named like errands. The script note that read dress it like the station. The gateway's whitelist, lifted without waking the device. The van laptop with the square icon labeled PA call, and the log that read delivered at 2:17 on 3 nights in a row. The crate of prepaid cards, the booster, the map with folds deep as scars. Survivors testified. The clinic nurse spoke about a corridor that went quiet after the loudspeakers said a name she recognized from a form. She spoke about men who paused in doorways and chose to forget they had eyes. A shopkeeper described waking to the horn and going to his shutter only to stop with his hand on the bar because the voice made him feel that opening a door would be a kind of disobedience. A porter's friend said the lanes near the go-down turned to stone when the horn spoke, and in stone you can walk without anyone noticing your feet. Mira took the stand with her hands folded like a singer about to start. She did not perform remorse. She described process. She explained stress marks and syllable breaks and how you capture a stranger room's breath and drape it over a sentence until the ear accepts it. She named the times she recorded missing pieces in her booth so a certain set of names could be built. She explained cash payments through a front that had no reason to need her work otherwise. She said she believed she was building a demo for clinics and schools. She admitted that belief was comfortable because rent is not a theory. Defense counsel for Mira tried to keep her on the path of naivete. The prosecutor let enough doubt into the air to show agency. The judge scribbled notes and, once, looked directly at Asha as if to ask whether he was being led into technical weeds. She offered the smallest shake of her head. The weeds hid nothing, only soil. Parth sat with his lawyer, back straight, eyes forward. When his turn came, he spoke like a man who had run out of the energy required to pose. He told the court the part of the story that was his to tell. The inquiry, the dismissal, the shop, the nights he drove to the river to call a machine that lived in a sealed room. He said he told himself he was frightening the right people. He said he heard later about the wrong people being found cold. He said he continued because stopping meant admitting he had begun. His lawyer steered him away from full confession and toward contrition rooted in grief. The judge allowed grief to exist without permitting it to become a shield. Raku listened like a statue with a pulse. His lawyer built around him a wall of suggestions. Misidentification, coincidence of timing, an innocent errand at a bad hour. The satchel was a kit for cleaning. The knife was a tool for boxes. The tuned exhaust was vanity. The phone going dark was habit. 100 small explanations were stacked into an edifice that did not reach the ceiling. The prosecution dismantled each piece in the order the city would have taken it. The timeline board went up. The camera frame from the flyover with the diagonal cut in the tread. The frame from the go-down lane with the hot white headlamp center. The towel with the chemical note that had lingered longer than shame. The satchel with the bottle that did not belong to cleaning unless a person cleaned people off the board of a case. The roll of tape with the serrated tongue. The coincidence of phones going dark at 2:15 on nights when the horn spoke. Asha testified last. She told the court about the dust that remembered silence and the soot ring that marked recent vibration. About walking the shutter line and finding only her own print. About the hum that continued with the breaker down. About the blue slit behind the faceplate that woke before the voice. About writing the names in her notebook the way one writes inventory for a difficult debt. She stayed with the plain things. She spoke of fear without showing it any drama. When defense counsel tried to suggest a city's superstition had guided her more than evidence, she repeated what the judge had said on the first morning. No ghosts, wires and people. The court settled as if it had wanted someone to say it simply. Closing arguments had none of the music such rooms sometimes acquire. The prosecutor refused lyricism. He pointed to the chain that ran from solar panel to battery to gateway to whitelist to van to satchel to knife to bodies. He said the horn speakers had been turned into a tool for terror. He said the law recognized tools. He asked for the names of the dead to be allowed to return to being names, not signals. The judge's summing up was short. The city's trust is not a toy, he said. A public address system is a promise made to crowds that they will not be misled. He called the horn broadcasts what the law required. Unlawful threats. He called the murders by their plain name. He separated intent and effect with care and then connected them with the rope the evidence had provided. Verdict. Guilty. Rakesh Johar for multiple counts of murder and criminal intimidation. Guilty. Parth Suri for conspiracy, unlawful access, and intimidation by broadcast. Guilty. Meera Anand for aiding and tampering. Sentencing would follow, but the words had already marked them. The room breathed out. The rail representative, when called for a statement, promised audits and locks and a season of attention. The judge cut him short and ordered the southern wing sealed under court supervision while the illegal gateway was removed. He directed that the horn speakers, as objects, were not to be fetishized in the press. They were evidence, not altars. In the corridor afterward, Asha leaned her forehead for a second against a wall cool enough to give back a little kindness. The technician from the lab passed with his bag and nodded like a man leaving a temple. Meera stood alone, looking at her hands. Parth sat on a bench between two constables, gazing at the floor as if a piece of solder had fallen there and might be recovered. Raku was moved past them with his chin still up, trying to lock his face in a shape he could live with. Asha walked back toward the station she had spent so many nights in. The southern wing waited behind its shutter like a patient at last called for surgery. She would be there when the panel came down and the battery was lifted and the gateway went into a bag. She would be there when the breaker was thrown and the hum died. She would be there when they climbed the ladder and put a hand on each cone. Not to bless it, but to make sure dust returned to being only dust. Present a clean chain from machine to murder. The court has spoken in a voice that belongs to law. Now return the wing to silence. Do it properly. Final part, names over a locked platform. The locksmith arrived with a canvas bag that could have been for shoes. He unrolled his tools on the floor of the southern wing and looked around as if the room might tell him a joke. A court officer stood by to supervise the removal. The guard who had kept his stool on long nights rubbed his thumbs together as if warming a coin. The technician from the lab bent to the rack with the reverence of a man who is about to undo a knot he respects. Asha signed the inventory sheet. The pen made a dry sound, like sand over glass. She checked the seals on the doors one more time, although she had checked them already. Habit is a kind of prayer that does not ask for anything. They began with the vent. The grill came away without fighting this time. The black panel sat where it had sipped at light, obedient to a purpose it had not chosen. The technician held it to the window a moment, not to admire it, only to see the dust print it left on his palm, proof that machines gather the world even when they pretend to ignore it. He slid it into a padded envelope and wrote a number on the label without flourish. Inside the equipment room, the rack opened like a chest. The small battery sat taped in its cradle, a tidy heart that had beaten too long. The technician cut the ties with a murmured apology and lifted the pack away. He laid it on the table between a cloth bundle of screws and the neat box that had housed the gateway. He eased the gateway out last, leaving its cable for the end as if unspooling a story from the final sentence back to the first. The stub antenna came free of its disguise. The relay over the mute lay exposed, solder blots shining like small dark eyes. The locksmith turned his attention to the shutter locks. Their brass had taken on the color of old seeds. He worked them gently, not because he cared if they lived, but because he disliked breaking tools if he could avoid it. The locks surrendered themselves in quiet stages. When they finally fell into his palm, he handed them to the court officer who bagged them like captured insects. Asha climbed the ladder and put her hand near each horn speaker without touching the cones. The soot rings had not grown since the last night. No faint breath rose from the mouths. The air beside them felt like the inside of a cupboard that has been closed, not like the throat of a hall. She listened to the silence until silence became a thing with shape again rather than an absence to be filled. They killed the power at the breaker in the corridor, this time without skepticism, and watched the rack sag into a quiet that had no afterhum. The technician held his ear close and smiled at the absence as if at a well-made bed. The court officer signed his own name in the correct place. The guard looked at the blank faceplate and exhaled a long, slow breath. Not relief, not grief, only the body consenting to the end of a task. Asha walked the length of the wing one last time, past the welded windows, past the ticket counter with paint that had dried into scales. She paused by the square of daylight where a panel of shutter did not meet its mate and squinted through the opening. The living station beyond performed its practice drama. A porter pivoted with 2 suitcases balanced like opinions. A woman scolded a child for running and then laughed at her own fear. A man read aloud to his father a list of train numbers, slow and careful, to make them into a promise. She returned to the equipment room and wrote in her notebook. Gateway removed. Auxiliary power removed. Relay intact and catalogued. Rack secured. The words looked simple. They were the end of a thread that had run through nights like wire through a wall. She underlined the last entry and closed the book. The technician lingered at the door. He asked because some men of machines cannot stop, whether the horns should be left or replaced. Asha told him they would stay. They were not villains. They were furniture. The harm had come from hands. He nodded and returned to his padded envelopes. On the way out, Asha stopped by the ladder and looked up a final time. The cones stared back without requests. She thought of the names that had been pushed through them. Ria Vyas, Tarun Mehra, Imran Qureshi. She did not recite them like a ceremony. She let them sit in her head the way stones sit in a pocket, real and heavy, reminders of the shape of a coat. She met Mira on the steps outside. The woman had come to deliver a signed addendum to her statement and had stayed sitting under the weak shade of a pipe, as if unsure whether it would be allowed. Mira stood when she saw Asha and asked if the room would be closed for good. Asha said yes. Mira looked toward the shutter and then down at her hands, as if the closed gate relieved her of something she had been holding. She did not ask for comfort. She accepted the fact as if it were weather. Parth was brought under escort later, to witness the removal as required by a court that wanted its chain of custody to be more than a phrase. He walked slowly, as if matching his breath to a count. He stood very still in the equipment room doorway and looked at the rack without blinking. When the gateway left the bracket, something in his posture fell. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a photograph. A young face looked back at him, not smiling, not solemn, only busy being alive. He slid the photograph back and nodded that he had seen what he had come to see. He asked if he could sit. The officer said yes. He sat on the stool where Asha had drawn a map on the first night and stared at the floor. She left him there with the officer and walked away because some witnesses are allowed their private endings. By sundown, the southern wing was only a wing again. The shutter came down with a cleaner sound than it had made in years. A new court seal rode the seam like a small red eye. The locksmith put his tools away. The technician took his padded envelopes and his notes. The guard agreed to go home on time for once. Asha climbed the exterior stair that led to a catwalk along the edge of the main hall. From there, she could see the platform spread like pages. The evening announcements came and went in the official voice that belonged to timetables and patience. She listened for the seams she had learned to hear. There were none. Breath moved where breath should move. Consonants landed and did not scrape. The hiss carried no agenda. It was only the sound of distance being bridged by old speakers. She took out her notebook on the catwalk and wrote the closing note she had been turning over in her head since the first night when the wing had behaved like a throat. A station does not prophesy. People borrow its voice when they want to be believed. Cut the wire. She added one more sentence because she did not want the file to confuse her years from now when memory had gone soft at the edges. When a city trusts a certain sound, that trust is a responsibility. Do not let anyone outsource their guilt to a machine. Down on platform 3, a goods train moaned to wake itself and rolled through without stopping, a freight of blue boxes in a long measured line. The sound crossed the hall like breath held and released. Someone clapped a child on the shoulder. Someone asked for the time. Someone lifted a bag and discovered it was lighter than expected and laughed. The night came down more gently than the ones before. Asha stood on the catwalk until the last of the crimson sky wore off the rails and only street lamps remained to draw hard circles on the stone. She thought of families who would sleep a little better and of a handful of people who would not sleep at all and of a set of horn speakers that would sit in their rust and dust and be forgotten again. Forgetting is not forgiveness. It is how cities survive. She walked the length of the catwalk and took the stairs to the concourse. At the bottom step she stopped and looked back toward the sealed gate, an unremarkable shape in the wall. It reflected a sliver of the hall lights and held that sliver as if proud to catch anything at all. Beyond it lay only rails and red bulbs, a geometry as simple as childhood. There would be other cases, other men who tried to turn a system into a weapon, other rooms that insisted on holding their breath until someone asked them not to. Asha folded her notebook into her bag and joined the flow. A porter grinned at her in the unassuming way of men who work near rails. A woman carrying 2 sleeping children balanced her load without complaint. The official voice rose again, measured and ordinary, and told a platform to prepare. It did not say a name that did not belong. It did not point to any neighborhood like a finger. It was only a voice. It went where it was sent. It stopped when it had done enough. Outside the station, the air had cooled. A cycle rickshaw bell rang and did not echo. Far off, a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. Asha unlocked her car and paused with her hand on the door. She looked up at the building that had done what buildings do when asked well. It had contained a problem. It had held a secret until the right hands could remove it. It would go on now being a place where strangers walked and believed what they were told, because belief is necessary. She got in and drove away at an ordinary speed. Case closed. End of story. The case at the shuttered wing of New Delhi station ends, but the sound it left behind is the kind that never really fades, it just changes frequency. When a city learns to obey a voice, it also learns how dangerous it can be when that voice is stolen. Detective Asha Menon gave it back to the silence. A small victory against the noise we make to hide our guilt. If tonight's story left a hum in your chest, let it stay for a while. It means you were listening. Thank you for listening. To everyone who joins us each week on Somnolent Conspiracies, thank you for walking these midnight corridors with us, where every echo might be evidence and every silence might be a warning. If you'd like to keep following the whispers, remember to subscribe, ring the bell, and leave a like. It helps our stories reach new listeners lost in their own dark corners. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, even the quietest places still listen back. Somnolent Conspiracies, where the city never truly sleeps.